Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Horizon Kigoma wash process Rwanda from the Picky Chemist. And there's the bag right there. And the Picky Chemist, based out of Chaudfontaine, Belgium. And this coffee is our March 2024 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most want to see us review. And usually we try to get our Coffee of the Month reviews done by the end of the following month. Unfortunately, we missed the cutoff for this coffee's initial release, so we didn't get it until a lot later than I was initially expecting. So that's why this review might be a little later than normal, but better late than never, I suppose. We will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 45. And recipe we went with for this coffee was certainly pushing this one a fair bit at a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, 99 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. With this one, I went even more fine on that grind by a couple of notches, in fact. Roast profile for this coffee. So this one is actually one of their Omni roasted coffees, which is kind of interesting considering that this one still turned out very light and it still skews on that very extremely light side of the spectrum, as this is still one of the lightest roasted coffees we've reviewed this year, as the Picky Chemist is in general one of the lightest roasting coffee roasters out there. This is an extremely light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 22 first impression, and luckily for me, I was able to give this one a little bit more adequate rest relative to some other coffees, but we opted for the V60, and it was quite reminiscent of Rwandan coffees in general, as it was offering a notable bit of the savoriness, but also a nice level of sweetness, as the listed vanilla definitely felt on the more present side of things, especially in the cool down. It was a little bit more intense than I've typically experienced with Picky Chemist's wash processed coffees, as there's a fair bit of citrus as well, lending itself to a pretty nice first impression. We move on to day 25 as we opted for the Chemex, and this was a little bit more in line with our previous experiences, as it just turned out very light and delicate to the point where the entirety of the cup felt a little undefined. And this is the first time that I saw that the Chemex didn't really seem to do justice to this coffee, especially on this try, as there was a slight savory tea aspect with some soft red fruits as well, lending itself to just an okay second impression. Day 28 opted for the April Brewer, and the cup is still pretty similar as the previous day, as it focuses on the savory black tea aspects, with the cup being on the more subtle side of things. Intensity does open up a little bit more on the cool down, but I'm still getting some Kenyan-like attributes as well, with some interesting red fruits and brightness. We move on to day 31 as we opted for some higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and the cup was extremely tea-like, especially off brew, as perhaps there was a slight bit of better definition to the cup in general, with some of the Rwandan-like aspects definitely much more present now. And I think for people that have a lot of familiarity between Kenyan and Rwandan coffees, you can kind of tell that there's a difference in the savoriness, whereas the Rwandan, I would say, is maybe a little bit more earthy at times, as opposed to the Kenyan, which can be definitely much more red fruit and even tomato-like at times. Essentially tasted like Lipton iced tea, and that's the best and most interesting descriptor I do have for this coffee from this point going forward, as well, as I could not help but feel that it was about as precise of a definition as I could find to this coffee in general, because it just had that very similar flavor and profile to it. Some slight pastry sweetness present in the finish, but for the most part, it was a very savory tea-like cup. Day 34 opted for the Chemex with higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and it was a little better relative to some of the earlier experiences we had, but it continued to remind me once again of that Lipton brisk iced tea, and I can't really express just how similar this coffee profile was reminding me of that specific drink. In addition to that, once the cup reached room temperature, the sweetness continued to increase, and that was definitely my favorite part of this coffee, was that really extended cool down. When I mean extended cool down, I mean definitely letting it get all the way down to room temperature, to the point where the coffee actually just does taste kind of cold in general. That's when I really saw so much of these sweeter aspects present within this one. Day 37 opted for the V60 with the same adjustments, and there's consistency to the cup as it continues to offer that profile reminiscent of that iced tea-like aspect, with nice clarity. The cup continuing to open on the cool down with the listed spice-like attributes. There's a bit of sugariness as well, a pretty high level of sweetness at that room temperature level. To the point where you get to that though, it definitely skews a lot more on that savory tea-like side of things. Day 40 opted for the Chemex with a more fine grind, and I just decided to stick with the V60 from that point going forward, as it was a little strange off brew. And I don't necessarily like saying this, but it's the honest reality of this. This brew did remind me a little bit of the Lipton chicken noodle after I had let it cool down to a certain extent. It even had a slight bit of the aroma when I was brewing it to that, and I said, okay, there's something that maybe I did wrong with this one, but it wasn't necessarily the most ideal thing. I said it was much more of the savoriness, but it was skewing a little bit more in a direction that wasn't necessarily ideal. As it did cool down though, there was much more of that tea-like and savory-like aspect to this one as well. Day 43, final notes that I do have, and we opted for the V60 with the highest extraction adjustments we had made up to that point. And I said, you know what, let's keep going. Let's turn the notch a little further as well on this one in terms of the fineness of this grind, continue at the higher temperatures and go even lower on that concentration at that 17-1. And I feel like it paid dividends, mostly because I think it gave me a better and more clear idea and impression of this coffee in general, as it felt like a very long steeped tea. And I know this seems, I want to say, intuitive or just very straightforward when you kind of think about it, but basically the more I increased the extraction, the more it just felt like you were steeping the tea for a longer period of time, as at this time I felt like I had basically had that same iced tea that I had been drinking all the way up to this point, but given that I just kind of let it seep there for much longer, it just felt like a much more intense version of that. In addition to that, there's plenty of that strong savoriness as well as that sweeter spiced finish. So the overall intensity of this coffee did seem to go up quite a bit, and it resulted in what felt like a lot of the same aspects just being much more pronounced. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick, and it is the savoriness at the level 5. And I feel like the main reason I wanted to put it all the way up there was mostly because of the immense amount of definition that was present in those tea-like aspects. As I said, I can't recall a coffee I've had that has been maybe that precise in terms of that specific tea-like attribute, as it was very present. And then by the time I made this final tasting wheel, which was on the final day, and really increasing the extraction on this one, I just felt like there was so much intensity to it, like a tea that may have been slightly oversteeped, to the point where it justified being there at that level 5 mark, as this one was about as tea forward as I think I've experienced from pretty much any coffee, especially, yeah, just any coffee in general I can recall having reviewed. Handful of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness. Yeah, this is a very clean cup of coffee, especially given that the definition in this one was quite precise. In addition to that, it was a little bit more subtle and tame on the earlier days, so at no point was there anything to kind of take away from the overall cleanliness. Boars felt like the great place for that. Finish, level 4. And it did skew specifically in that more sweet direction, so that's why I mentioned that the finish of this coffee was one of the more enjoyable attributes for me. And we'll kind of get to that a little bit more with the next two things we're going to discuss, which I'll discuss together because honestly these three kind of belong together. The sweetness, the spice, and the finish all scoring that level 4 mark. And that's mostly because it did have that, I want to say, sweeter spice-like quality to it. I think they had something along the lines of vanilla. I could definitely see that. But for me, I would say it was just a little bit more of a sweeter spiced quality in general. So level 4 for all of those felt ideal. Citrus, level 4, and as I was making this tasting wheel, I was really kind of thinking about that citric quality to it, because I said earlier I felt like there was a fair bit of the lime-like attribute, but the more I continued to brew this coffee and the more experience I had with it, the lime-like attribute did seem relatively dialed down to some of the earlier days, as the coffee initially started out a little bit more, we'll say, citric, and I was getting a little bit more brightness to it and a little bit more of those Kenyan-like berry attributes as well. But the more I had this coffee, the more I felt like it was skewing in that tea-like direction, to the point where it seemed to kind of dominate the rest of the coffee, where those weren't quite as present as they had been on the earlier days. And that's why the brightness is kind of surprising to me at that level 3. But as I was making this tasting wheel initially, I said, you know, this isn't quite as bright as some of the Kenyan coffees that we review in general. And even though it's on the higher side of level 3, I didn't necessarily feel it reached that specific mark. So that's why that's there at the level 3. Same thing with the florality, because there's that slight vanilla-like attribute, that vanilla floral component to it, which is also displayed in that chocolate being there at that level 2. That's what that is, honestly. So yeah, those things felt like a level 3 for me, which is just kind of counterintuitive to what I might have expected going into this tasting wheel. But the final thing, well, Berry fruit level 3 as well, mentioned that briefly. Those kind of Kenyan-like red berries, a little bit more present and prominent in the earlier days. Final thing worth discussing though is the body at a level 2, as this one interestingly was a lot more lighter bodied than I might have expected going into it, but that's just kind of where this coffee charted by the end. As I am looking at this tasting wheel though, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I've kind of said in the past that when it comes to the Picky Chemist's wash process coffees, I continue to struggle with them in a number of ways, and the biggest of which being that I oftentimes struggle with the overall delicacy of their coffees, as sometimes they are coming out a little bit too tame and a little bit too delicate. When it comes to this coffee, I feel like I got it to a point where there was enough intensity to it that it's somewhat displayed in that tasting wheel, but the intensity to it was very interesting in general, mostly because of just how precise of a definition there was to this coffee, and the way I was able to bring out that intensity to the point where this entire experience just reminded me a little bit more of drinking tea, mostly because essentially the adjustments I made went from being not leaving the tea bag in there long enough to I've left the tea bag in there too long, and now this tastes so much like a overly steeped tea, where I feel like I got a very good idea and picture of what this coffee was supposed to be. It just ended up being a little bit different from what I might have expected. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you really like the tea-like aspects of coffee in general, then this one's an ideal fit, especially given that it had that lighter profile to it. It had plenty of those tea-like attributes as well, while still being complemented with some nice, sweeter components to it, as I couldn't help but feel that this coffee acted so much more like tea than I can recall from a number of coffees that we've reviewed in the past, which for that reason made it a little bit more interesting of a review. If I'm being completely honest, I feel like I got a better idea and picture of this coffee relative to some of their other wash processed coffees. But that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, especially since it was our coffee of the month, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Horizon Kigoma wash process Rwanda from the Picky Chemist. Thank you for watching.